welcome back to the Social Audio Think Tank. Josh here from Australia with my friend Jackson from Oz Podcast. How you going, Jackson?
I'm going very well, thank you, Josh.
That was different. You usually say you're going good. So
I decided halfway through the sentence that I had to change it up. That
might have been why I mentioned that. I had the feeling you did that. And given that we're recording this audio only over Skype, I'm not sure how I figured that out. But I guess when you've done enough episodes with someone, you can preempt what they're going to do. So today we are doing an episode called the Fidel-isode. So it is not about Fidel Castro. It has nothing to do with any kind of Cuban-based leaders of any kind. It is basically about sound and fidelity. So if you're unfamiliar with that word, it's basically the quality of a sound and I guess everything from the balance to how clear it is. The better sounding something is, I guess it would be described as high fidelity. So, and that was my very non-technical, non-audio engineer explanation of that. So Jackson, you can jump all over me at any time if I'm explaining things badly.
Well, I think the moment where you said high fidelity, it might have glitched a little bit. So just to prove your point.
Just for anyone who is wondering, for these Skype calls, I've actually been recording the last few episodes on Audacity from my end, doing what is commonly called in podcasting a double-ender, where regardless of what each of us are hearing through Skype or through whatever medium you're recording, it's actually getting recorded natively at your end and Jackson at his end. And if it turns out the Skype recording is rubbish, which it could be, we actually have nice, clean versions of ourselves talking from each end. So we might go into that further in the future as to why you would choose to do a double ender or be recording two sound sources at once. But for today, we're just going to talk about fidelity and how important sound quality is and whether you can actually post-produce your show too much. So I know Jackson listens to slightly different shows than what I do that maybe fall a little bit more into the NPR, BBC, like public radio kind of sphere where they use high production values and lots of sound beds and all that kind of stuff. Whereas I have traditionally not listened to a lot of shows like that, but I am more so now. So I think our perspectives, once again, will be slightly different on what's too much post-production. So do you have a general quality that you will and won't listen to before we kick on, Jackson?
Well, I think there's sort of two elements to the quality. There's sort of the technical aspect of, is everything audible? Is there distortion? Stuff like that. But then there's also the stuff you mentioned there. The radio stuff is the content production. If they're going to have music in the background, stuff like that, if they're going to have sound effects, ambient noise. So they're two very different things. I think with the content production, I'm happy to take that or leave it. I like it, but at the same time, it's not going to turn me on or off a podcast. In terms of the technical production, I think that is a much more a deal breaker for me. If there's two people and one of them's considerably louder than the other, or if there's a lot of whispering and then suddenly there's a really loud noise because it's not compressed properly or something like that, that's gonna turn me off listening to a podcast.
So I think even this early in the episode, we completely disagree, which is interesting. That I am completely content oriented to a certain degree, I guess, that regardless of how great a show sounds, I don't believe that the content is solid or it's just not interesting to me, I just basically won't listen to a show that I'm not interested in the topic or the hosts or the personalities, because I don't have a hardcore audio engineering background or interest in audio production to the point where I'll listen to something just because of the production values, but I won't listen to a show that I think has weak content. In saying that, though, obviously, if I have the choice between two shows that are, just take comedy, for example, if they're a similar amount of funniness and I happen to like the host about the same amount and they're both sitting there ready for me to download in Castro or the iTunes app, if I only had an hour, for example, I would probably choose to listen to the Crab Feast over listen to the Nerdist, because they do generally have far, far better production values than someone like the Nerdist, who have great production, then average, then awful, then cool, and then great, or whatever. They jump all over the place. So within one moment, I might choose to go with a better produced show, but overall, it's got to be content I like and that I'm interested in, or I just won't listen regardless. So do you think maybe your opinion comes from your audio engineering background a little bit?
Yes, I think it does, because I sort of know how all of that works. And in fact, even in my own podcast, it took me a long time to get to a stage where it felt natural and it wasn't just super compressed and heavy EQs and crazy noise reduction. And it got to a point where it was loud, clear, natural, and that was all it needed. So yeah, I really hear that in other people's podcasts. There was an episode recently of Tofop
which is Will Anderson and Australian Comedians podcast for anyone not from Australia. So sorry,
this one he got his original co-host Charlie Clausen back on, and it was clearly the two of them sitting either side of a table with a Zoom H4n in between, and they each had handheld mics, probably SM58, something like that, plugged into the Zoom, and they were just having a chat with their handheld mics. Only Will Anderson had forgot to switch the Zoom to the mic, to the input settings, so it was just recording through the built-in microphone on the Zoom. I was just getting the ambient room noise. And then at some point, the dog came in and was barking at the Zoom. And at some point, they dropped the Zoom off the table. So, yeah, that's tough to listen to. It's tough for me to listen to that and not be thinking the whole time, oh, I just press the button. Oh, that sounds really annoying. Oh, the background noise, ambient. No. So, yeah, I have a hard time with that.
I'm a fan of his show. I mean, I'm not the biggest Will Anderson / Tofop fan, which I've spoken about before, but I'm into his show enough that I would tolerate a certain amount of lack of production, but that was probably a little bit too much. And for anyone out there that's wondering, can you record with just the mics on a built-in recorder? You absolutely can, and if you do it well and they're positioned in the right way, you can record great sounding stuff with those. But I think it was just the room they were in, and they were obviously, the table was reflecting a lot into the mics. It sounds as though in that particular episode, all the doors were closed as well. So it really did just sound like a huge echo chamber. And Will has quite a lot of projection in his voice, whereas Charlie has a more somber voice. And it was really noticeable in that episode that Will's voice could cut through everything, but Charlie's really didn't. And yeah, that must have been disappointing for someone that, for them to have genuinely better and better production as the show went on, but maybe just rushing or just not paying attention or too many beers or whatever it happened to be, they recorded a shocker, basically. So,
yeah, that's the thing is you can definitely do that with just the H4n. You don't necessarily need the handheld microphones, just they didn't do it right. There is a way to do it with that equipment, because they didn't know they were doing it, they did it wrong, basically.
I mean, just to really put things in perspective, my full-on total rubbish hobby show where we just, swear and have fun and talk about prog rock and stuff, and it goes off on a million tangents. One of the most popular episodes I've done on that show was myself and 3 good mates in a hotel room with my iPhone. And that's compared to a lot of episodes where it's been 3 or 4 people in a room with anything from AT2005s to high PR40s into a nice Yamaha desk with compressors and into the Roland R-05 recorder. Those have got less downloads because they just simply maybe they weren't as funny, or maybe the topic wasn't as interesting. So you can get great stuff without huge production values. Just, I think that once you establish a certain sound, and maybe it goes back to what we were talking about in the Implode-isode or Explode-isode, one of those 2 episodes, I don't think you can afford to fall too far off the mark too often. And I'm pretty sure that if Will Anderson had too many episodes where he stuffed that up and they all sounded horrible, it might affect his audience. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's kind of a thing that makes me think of, we did a couple of live podcasts, and that's recording in a live environment. It's obviously going to degrade the sound somewhat. There's going to be a lot of reverb or ambient noise and mic spill and stuff like that. But when you get up at the start and you say, this is a live podcast, deal with it, it's sort of, you can sort of forgive it a little bit, and the audience knows what to expect, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think live podcasting is maybe slightly different sound-wise. Although I've heard some good sounding stuff from This Week in Radio Tech. I listened to that show for a while before I realised that it's just way too technical for my mind. Yeah, it was just way over my head, like a lot of really industry-based terminology and stuff that I really didn't understand. But yeah, that they had a absolutely fantastic sounding live sound in a really, really noisy exhibition floor at NAB or whatever it was in America, the National Association of Broadcasters. So it is possible. But yeah, I think you're right that there's certain situations where things are forgivable. And like if you see someone that you want to interview and all you have is your phone, get the interview. Who cares if it doesn't sound like your proper studio? Because there's certain conversations you get the chance to have that maybe are just on the fly and you have to record them with whatever setup you can. And I think if you're out in the field particularly and you have the chance to record something, I would go with the simplest, most bomb-proof version that takes the least amount of time to set up. And that could be literally just your phone might be more reliable than trying to get 2 handheld mics, 2 cables, and a Zoom H4n to work and then accidentally not turning it on properly, which, going back to that example. Overall, though, getting back to the start of the topic with the Fidel-isode, I have a real issue with, and I know you're going to hate me for saying this, but there are certain shows out there where I really admire the quality of the content. It's just fantastically done, like 99% invisible. That is so compressed to the point where if you're outside and you're walking along next to a road, you actually can't hear the show because it is just booming in your ears and it's so fatiguing. And I just don't think that people realize that when you're listening to the radio, generally people listen to the radio at home or maybe in a vehicle or at work. They're not outside generally. Like a lot of people that listen to the radio aren't outside. And it's not like you pre-download a radio program, then go for a walk. Like it's all happening live. So you would probably have to stream it if you were outside. But I don't think that there's enough thought given to the fact that people consume podcasts in maybe far more noisy situations than what they would consume radio. Because, I mean, most modern cars are quite well soundproofed. So having a heavily compressed sound in that environment is nothing compared to what it's like if you're a pedestrian walking along the side of the road. And I'll happily call out someone in the podcasting industry, Cliff Ravenscraft, the podcast answer man. I think overall you would have to say he has the best voice out of all those guys naturally. And overall, he probably has the best production sound. But there's certain situations where his voice is so heavily compressed that just to turn it up loud enough over the ambient noise actually fatigues my ears because it's compressed that much with a multi-band compressor. Obviously, his overall production is amazing, and I'm not going to disparage that, but I think you really need to be mindful of the fact that your audience could be exercising, they could be going to play basketball. They could be doing whatever. They could be just cruising around the house and then maybe there's a construction site next door. I think people need to be able to turn up your podcast to an audible level without getting absolutely punished with compression. And I know you've mentioned before that you feel that you maybe overcompressed your voice to just an unnatural level on your own shows in the past. Did you want to tell us how you worked that out? And when was it that you figured out, wow, that's not very natural compression?
When I started, I was compressing to the point where it was distorting. But I think the reason I was compressing was because I was listening to shows that maybe weren't compressed at all. And I'd be listening on the train or something. And if there's a loud noise on the train, for the most part, I can hear the loud sounds. But if there's maybe a guest that for some reason is really quiet, I'm either not going to hear it or I'm going to have to turn it up. And then when it goes back to the loud part, that's going to be too loud. So I'm going to be fiddling with the volume knob up and down the whole podcast. So that's why I was compressing everything to make it so at least everything's the same.
You mean the same volume?
Yeah.
Maybe to just get a little bit more geeky. From an audio engineer's point of view, when people talk about normalization, leveling, and compression, what is the difference between normalizing your sound so it's all one volume or leveling with something like Levelator, which is a free sound leveling app, for Mac and for the PC. What is the big difference between, as far as pure volume of the overall track, between compressing and normalizing something?
I haven't actually used Levelator, so I'm only going to guess at what it does.
Basically, it normalizes the track, so it brings it all up to, about the same volume, I guess you could say.
Well, there's sort of two ways to normalize. The first is just find the loudest sound in the track and turn everything up until that reaches 0, or the loudest point possible, because digital volumes are measured in negatives, so 0 is the loudest point. Or you can do it so it normalizes across the whole track, so it sort of resamples the loudest point. It's sort of like an instant compression. It just makes, if there's a particular chunk that's really quiet, it's going to turn it up. So I think it basically just turns up all the peaks all to 0 and makes them all as loud as each other, which could work, but then you'd have to have really clean audio, because if there was any distortion or background noise, that's going to get turned up and there's going to be a really huge spike in noise. So I mostly just use compression just to make, especially the last couple of episodes of Social Audio Think Tank, I realized too late that I'd recorded myself a lot quieter than I'd recorded you. So my voice was coming through a lot softer. And I had to, I could have put some more effort in and cut all of every word of mine out. But then there's the bits where we might be talking over each other, stuff like that. So I had to compress myself a bit more, which in turn might have over-compressed you slightly, which wouldn't be that much of a problem. It wasn't a huge amount of compression. But with the sibilance that we were getting from your voice on the Sennheiser MD421s, it just makes that sibilance a lot more noticeable, I think.
Cool. My layman's understanding of how compression works basically is, unlike normalizing where everything gets brought up to maybe the maximum volume of the track or something approximating that, compression will actively squash down the loudest points and lift up the quietest points. So it basically is continuously balancing to kind of one level and not just lifting everything. Because, when you do that, I know I've tried to do that. I've recorded a track too quiet, and then I try to boost myself up in Audacity, for example, and I just drag the gain level up to make myself louder. It will actually lift any background noise that you have in there. So
compression does sort of do that, in that it turns down the loud parts first, and then it turns everything up. Yeah, it's sort of complicated. That's sort of the simplest way to say it. It's not quite the same as just turning it up.
Cool. No, that's all right. Maybe we can reach out to the audience. My Twitter's at Joshua C. Liston, and Jackson, yours is?
At Oz Podcasts.
At Oz Podcast. And maybe you guys can let us know if too much production bothers you, if you find that heavily compressed shows fatigue you, or you can't actually hear them because they're so bass and multi-band compression heavy when you're outside, like I can't with a lot of shows that are like that. And I actually would prefer to, I guess in the end, I would prefer to hear an approximation of what the person sounds like in real life, because it's not like radio where I've absolutely no interest in ever talking to or listening to or, confiding in or anything someone that's on the radio. Generally, I just think they're a bunch of dicks. And I'm talking about super commercial radio here. And I say that without actually knowing any of them personally, but whereas with a podcaster, the shows that I really like, I would love to hang out with those guys and, shoot the shit with them and just talk about whatever. And I like to know that they sound somewhat like what they do when I hear them talk, because I've heard certain big podcasters who really compress their voice do YouTube videos maybe where they're giving a speech or something, and they sound like not even the same person. And it makes me think, wow, I'm not so sure I want to hang out with that guy now, because he doesn't sound like himself, or he's trying really hard not to sound like himself. So that gets back to maybe my artistic wanky side, I guess.
Well, the other thing that you mentioned before was if you've got a 30, 60, 90-minute podcast and it's super compressed, you're going to get fatigued and you're going to have to just turn it off, because like audio fatigue is a real thing, and you will just get tired from listening to something that's too compressed.
Cool. Well, that's a great way to finish up today. Someone who actually knows what they're talking about. I like that. Cool. So at Joshua C. Listen on Twitter for me.
And at Oz Podcasts.
Cool. And once again, if you're liking the show and you wanted to support the Oz Podcast Network, of which Social Audio Think Tank is a part of, you can go to patreon.com/Oz Podcasts, and that's OZ Podcasts. And just check out what's going on there. Jackson's offering some really, really cool stuff, and it helps our small network to grow, and that's really, really awesome. So,
well, you said I've got some cool stuff on offer, but I want to have more cool stuff on offer. So if there's any particular content, if you've got any ideas for stuff that I can offer you in return for your $1 or your $5, then let me know at Oz Podcasts. But yeah, I'll also be working to try and think up some more things I can offer to patrons.
Excellent. Cool. Radio. See you later, everyone.
Home and away, fighting for a piece of you. Just a little moment slipping away.
Listen to Australian podcasts. ozpodcasts.com.au